Some men are born to violence, others have it thrust upon them. But the rarest kind are those who master it, then walk away. The frontier remembers such men in whispers, legends built on blood and gun smoke that drift like tumbleweeds across the plains. They speak of hands that never miss eyes, that see what others can't, and the ghostly precision that comes when death becomes a craft rather than a consequence. But what they don't tell is what silence sounds like after the killing stops. How a man carries the weight of every life taken. How mercy can be more devastating than vengeance. In the dust of a forgotten town at the edge of civilization, one such legend has been hiding in plain sight. His voice buried beneath the precision tick of 100 timepieces. His hands still steady, his eyes still sharp. Until today, when the past comes calling with violence riding shotgun and 15 years of hatred burning like wildfire across the prairie. The clock's pendulum swung with meticulous precision, each tick marking another second of silence in Solomon Blackwood's workshop. His weathered hands steady as bedrock adjusted the delicate gears of a pocket watch. Morning light streamed through dust-filled air, illuminating the dozens of timepieces that lined the walls of his small shop at the edge of Whisper Creek. At 62, Solomon's face was a map of deep lines, each one earned through hardship. His eyes sharp and alert, despite his age, focused entirely on his work. The right hand, which locals sometimes whispered about, moved with uncanny precision, each finger knowing its purpose with absolute certainty. The shop door creaked open. Solomon didn't look up. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood." Grace Andrews called her 18-year-old voice, bringing life to the quiet shop. She hung her shawl on the rack by the door and moved to the workbench. "Sheriff Maddox says his watch is running fast again. Probably been winding it too tight like always." Solomon nodded but didn't speak. He never did. Grace had been working for him for nearly 2 years, now serving as his voice to customers and his companion during long workdays. The arrangement suited them both, the orphan girl and the mute watchmaker at the edge of a frontier town that was slowly transforming from wilderness outpost to something resembling civilization. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if her grandfather clock will be ready by Sunday." Grace continued organizing tools that were already perfectly arranged. "I told her you never rush perfection, but you know how she gets about entertaining the banker's wife." Solomon's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, his version of a smile. He reached for a small notepad beside his workbench and wrote in a neat, disciplined hand, "Tell her Saturday." No promises. Grace read the note and nodded. "I'll let her know, though she might faint from excitement that it'll be early." The morning continued in its comfortable routine. Customers came and went, most speaking only to Grace, though a few nodded respectfully to Solomon. The old watchmaker's silence was as much a part of Whisper Creek as the creek itself. Few remembered a time when Solomon Blackwood had spoken a word, though he'd lived in the town for 15 years. At noon, Sheriff Maddox appeared at the door, his tall frame blocking the sunlight momentarily. Unlike most men who entered the watchmaker's shop, Maddox looked Solomon directly in the eye. "Solomon," he said with a nod, then turning to Grace, "Miss Andrews." Grace smiled brightly. "Sheriff, your watch isn't ready yet. Mr. Blackwood says you're hard on the poor thing." "Not here about the watch," Maddox said, removing his hat. At 55, Maddox carried his years with dignity. His salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed his posture, military straight. "Need to talk to Mr. Blackwood alone if you don't mind." Grace glanced at Solomon, who nodded subtly. "I'll go check on Mrs. Patterson's clock parts at the post office," she said, grabbing her shawl. "Be back in an hour." When the door closed behind her, Maddox took a seat on the customer's stool. Solomon continued working, but his eyes flicked up briefly, questioning. "Train came in from the east this morning," Maddox said, his voice lowered. "Brought news you need to hear." Solomon set down his tools, giving Maddox his full attention. "Cyrus Holloway received a presidential pardon 3 weeks ago, released from Leavenworth Prison." Solomon's hands, which hadn't trembled in 15 years of delicate watchmaking, gave the slightest twitch. "That's not all," Maddox continued. "Telegraph operator received a message this morning. Someone's been asking about you, described as a well-dressed man with a limp." Solomon's face remained impassive, but he reached for his notepad and wrote, "When message came from Fort Laramie, 4 days ago, Maddox leaned forward. That's not much of a head start, Solomon wrote again. Does he know I'm here? Can't say for certain, but Whisper Creek isn't exactly a secret, and neither is the mute watchmaker who lives here. Maddox stood, placing his hat back on his head. Thought you should know, in case you want to move on. Solomon shook his head once definitively. Figured you'd say that. Maddox sighed. Just remember, I'm not the only one around here who remembers the war stories about Ghost Hand. Blackwood, they never really died. After Maddox left, Solomon sat motionless at his workbench. For the first time in years, he wasn't seeing the gears and springs before him. Instead, his mind filled with images from a past he'd tried to bury, a Virginia battlefield strewn with bodies, a burning homestead on the Nebraska frontier, and a man's face twisted with hatred as Solomon's bullet shattered his knee. 15 years. 15 years of silence and clockwork. 15 years of atonement that would never be enough. And now the past was riding toward Whisper Creek, carried by a man who had every reason to want Solomon Blackwood dead. Solomon opened the bottom drawer of his workbench, a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay a worn leather holster, empty. He stared at it for a long moment, then slowly closed the drawer. Some ghosts he knew couldn't be outrun. 2 days later, Whisper Creek buzzed with excitement over the approaching Independence Day celebration. The town had grown considerably in recent years, now boasting a proper hotel, 3 saloons, and even a small opera house where traveling shows occasionally performed, though still a frontier outpost. Whisper Creek was beginning to shed its rougher edges. Solomon worked through the morning, his mind only half on the watch he was repairing. The other half listened for hoofbeats that hadn't come yet, but Woody knew Cyrus Holloway too well to believe the man would simply let the past rest. Grace entered the shop, her arms laden with red, white, and blue bunting. The committee's decorating the town square. She announced, Mrs. Patterson insists you should close early, and help. I told her you'd sooner dance a jig in the saloon. Solomon's eyes crinkled in their almost smile, but there was tension in his shoulders that Grace noticed immediately. Are you feeling all right, Mr. Blackwood? She asked, setting the bunting down. You've been different since Sheriff Maddox visited. Solomon nodded dismissively and pointed to the bunting. Oh, I thought we might put some in the window. Grace explained, show some patriotic spirit. It's been 15 years since the war ended, after all. 15 years, the number echoed in Solomon's mind. A commotion outside drew their attention. Grace moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass. A fancy stagecoach just pulled up at the hotel. She reported, never seen one like it around here, all black with silver trim. King. Solomon joined her at the window, his movements unusually quick. Down the street, a sleek black coach had indeed stopped before the Grand Hotel. 4 matched black horses stamped impatiently as the driver secured the reins. A hotel porter rushed to open the coach door. The man who emerged wore a tailored black suit that marked him immediately as an Easterner. His silver-streaked dark hair was perfectly groomed, and he carried a silver-headed cane. Even from a distance, Solomon could see that the man leaned heavily on the cane as he walked, his right leg moving stiffly, unnaturally. Wonder who that is, Grace mused. Looks important. Solomon didn't respond. He didn't need to wonder. After 15 years, Cyrus Viper Holloway had arrived in Whisper Creek. Over the next 3 days, the town's attention fixed firmly on the mysterious Easterner and his entourage. Word spread quickly that Cyrus Holloway represented Eastern banking interests looking to invest in the territory's development. He met with the mayor, the bank manager, and several prominent ranchers. His manner was described as charming, refined, and generous, buying rounds at the saloon and making substantial donations to the Independence Day festivities. Solomon watched from the shadows of his shop, noting the 6 men who had accompanied Holloway. Hard-eyed men whose hands never strayed far from their weapons despite their city clothes. These weren't bankers or businessmen. On the morning of July 4th, Sheriff Maddox returned to the shop. He's been asking about you, he said without preamble, not directly but making inquiries about a watchmaker who served in the Union Army. Solomon nodded, unsurprised. What are you planning to do? Maddox asked. Solomon wrote on his pad, nothing until he does. That's what worries me. Maddox sighed. His men have been all over town paying particular attention to who's armed and who isn't. I've seen this kind of investment before. It usually ends with new deeds and old graves. Solomon wrote again. This isn't about land. Maybe not for him, Maddox conceded, but those men of his aren't here for the scenery. Whatever's coming, it won't just be between you and him. After Maddox left, Solomon opened the bottom drawer again. This time he removed the holster and placed it on the workbench. From a hidden compartment beneath, he extracted a worn Colt Army model, 1860 revolver wrapped in oiled cloth. He didn't unwrap it, merely confirming its presence before returning it to its hiding place. Grace found him staring at the empty holster when she arrived. Mr. Blackwood. Solomon quickly returned the holster to the drawer. The celebration's starting soon, she said, her tone careful. Everyone's gathering in the square. Will you come this year? Solomon rarely attended town gatherings, preferring the solitude of his shop. But today he nodded slowly and reached for his coat. The town square overflowed with people. Bunting decorated every storefront, and tables laden with food lined one side of the square. Children ran about with small flags, and a makeshift bandstand had been erected, where several townsfolk with musical inclinations were tuning their instruments. Solomon and Grace stood at the edge of the crowd. Several people nodded greetings to Solomon, a few even stopping to express surprise at his presence. He acknowledged them with slight nods, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. He spotted Holloway immediately. The man stood on the hotel porch across the square, surrounded by his men, surveying the celebration like a king overseeing his subjects. Even from a distance, Solomon could feel Holloway's gaze find him in the crowd. Mr. Blackwood, Grace said suddenly, that man on the hotel porch is staring at you. Solomon took Grace's elbow, gently guiding her toward the food tables, putting more people between them and Holloway's watching eyes. The band struck up a lively tune, and the mayor began a speech about the town's progress and bright future. Children laughed and played around the edges of the square. For a moment, the tension in Solomon's shoulders eased slightly, then the first shot rang out. The crack of gunfire froze the celebration instantly. On the bandstand, the mayor clutched his arm where a bullet had grazed him. Before anyone could react, 5 more shots followed in rapid succession, shattering bottles on the refreshment table and sending people diving for cover. Chaos erupted. Women screamed, men shouted, and children cried as the crowd scattered in all directions. Solomon grabbed Grace and pulled her behind the shelter of a wagon as more shots followed. It's coming from the hotel, someone shouted. Solomon peered around the wagon. Holloway's men had drawn their weapons and were firing seemingly at random, sending the townsfolk into panic. Holloway himself stood unmoved on the porch, watching the chaos with a satisfied smile. Sheriff Maddox and his deputies had taken cover and were returning fire, but they were outnumbered. Solomon saw one deputy fall, clutching his shoulder. A child's scream cut through the din. Solomon spotted a young boy no more than 5, frozen in terror in the middle of the square as bullets whizzed overhead. Without hesitation, Grace broke from Solomon's grasp and dashed toward the child. "Grace, no!" A woman shouted, the first time many in Whisper Creek had ever heard Solomon's voice. But the words were lost in the gunfire. Grace reached the boy, scooping him up in her arms, but as she turned to run back, one of Holloway's men took aim directly at her. Solomon's hand moved to his hip instinctively, but found only empty air. His gun was still in the shop. In one fluid motion, Solomon reached down, grabbed a small stone from the ground, pulled the leather watch band from his wrist, and with a single practiced motion, launched the stone with lethal accuracy. The makeshift slingshot sent the stone flying across the square, striking the gunman's weapon just as he fired. The gun jerked upward, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in the hotel facade. The gunman stared in shock at his weapon, then across the square, trying to identify who had made the impossible shot. In the confusion, Grace made it safely behind the wagon with the child. Slowly, the gunfire ceased. Holloway's men holstered their weapons as if the shooting had been nothing more than a scheduled entertainment. Sheriff Maddox and his remaining deputy emerged cautiously, weapons still drawn. Holloway stepped off the porch, leaning on his cane, and walked calmly into the middle of the square. "My apologies for the disturbance," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the now silent space. "My men were merely responding to what they thought was a threat." A misunderstanding, nothing more. Maddox approached Holloway, his gun still raised. That was no misunderstanding. That was deliberate terror. Holloway smiled thinly. I assure you, Sheriff, if we'd intended to cause terror, you'd have far more casualties than a grazed arm and a few broken bottles. He gestured around the square. Consider it a demonstration of force, something every community should understand before making important decisions about its future. The only decision this community's making is whether to hang you or just throw you in jail, Maddox growled. Holloway's smile didn't waver. Before you make hasty decisions, Sheriff, you might want to consider that I now own controlling interest in your town's bank, the water rights to Whisper Creek itself, and as of this morning, the mortgage on your precious town hall. He tapped his cane on the ground for emphasis. Progress comes to every frontier eventually. How painful that progress becomes is entirely up to you and your town. His eyes swept the crowd, finally landing on Solomon, who had emerged from behind the wagon. Some men understand the value of silence in the face of inevitable change. Holloway continued, others require more persuasive demonstrations. With a slight nod to his men, Holloway turned back toward the hotel. As he walked, two of his men grabbed Grace, who had been helping the crying child find his mother. Let her go, several townspeople shouted. Moving forward, Holloway's men drew their guns again, bringing the advance to a halt. The young lady will be our guest. Holloway announced insurance against any rash action by the good sheriff or anyone else who might object to progress. Solomon stepped forward, his face expressionless, but his eyes burning with an intensity that made even Holloway's hardened men hesitate. Holloway turned to face him directly. Mr. Blackwood, he said, emphasizing the name. After all these years, still letting others fight your battles, still hiding behind that convenient silence. He limped closer, his voice dropping so only Solomon could hear. 15 years, I waited for this moment. 15 years, planning exactly how I'd make you watch while I destroyed everything you care about, just like you did to me. He stepped back, raising his voice again. The young lady will be comfortable and unharmed, so long as everyone cooperates with our plans for Whisper Creek's future. As Holloway's men dragged Grace toward the hotel, her eyes locked with Solomon's. There was no fear in her gaze, only determination, and a strange confidence in the old watchmaker that few would have understood. Solomon stood motionless as Holloway and his men retreated to the hotel, taking Grace with them. The townspeople gathered around him, and Sheriff Maddox's voices rising in anger and fear. We have to do something. They'll kill us all. What about Grace? Sheriff Maddox raised his hands for quiet. Everyone go home, tend to the wounded. Stay off the streets until we figure this out. Reluctantly, the crowd dispersed, leaving Solomon and Maddox alone in the square. I know who he is, Maddox said quietly, and I know what happened between you two during the war. Solomon's gaze remained fixed on the hotel. This isn't just about money or land. Maddox continued, he's using the girl to draw you out. Solomon finally turned to Maddox, and in his eyes the sheriff saw something he hadn't seen in 15 years, the cold, calculating gaze of the man once known as Ghost Hand. Blackwood Solomon turned and walked with purposeful strides toward his shop. What are you planning to do? Maddox called after him. Solomon paused, looking back over his shoulder. The watching townspeople would later swear that for just a moment the old watchmaker's silent frame seemed to transform, shoulders, straightening stance, widening presence, expanding until he seemed to fill the street with something both terrifying and awesome. Then Solomon Blackwood continued toward his shop, each step measured and deliberate as a clock's pendulum, marking the end of 15 years of silence. Grace Andrews had never considered herself a fearful person. Orphaned at 16, when influenza took her parents within days of each other, she'd learned early that survival required both backbone and adaptability. But as she sat in the lavishly appointed hotel suite, watched by two of Holloway's armed men, she felt the first real tendrils of fear creeping up her spine. It wasn't the guns that frightened her. It was the calculating emptiness in Cyrus Holloway's eyes as he studied her from across the room. Tell me about Solomon Blackwood. Holloway said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey from a crystal decanter. He hadn't offered her a drink. He's a watchmaker, Grace replied, keeping her voice steady. The best in 3 territories. Holloway smiled without warmth. We both know he's considerably more than that. I don't know what you mean. No! Holloway settled into an upholstered chair, stretching his bad leg out before him. He's never spoken to you about his past. About the war? About how he earned the name Ghost Hand? Grace's surprise must have shown on her face because Holloway laughed softly. So he hasn't told you. How interesting. He sipped his whiskey. Solomon Blackwood was the deadliest marksman in the Union Army. They called him Ghost Hand because no one ever saw him draw before his target was down. Some said it was like being shot by a ghost. Grace shook her head slightly. Mr. Blackwood doesn't speak. Oh, he can speak, Holloway said, his voice hardening. He chooses not to, just like he chose to put a bullet through my knee instead of my heart 15 years ago. He tapped his cane against his right leg, left me alive to suffer, called it mercy. Holloway's words crystallized something Grace had sensed but never articulated about her employer. There had always been a depth to Solomon Blackwood that belied his simple watchmaker exterior. A watchfulness, a capability that seemed at odds with his quiet occupation. What do you want from him? Grace asked. I want him to suffer as I've suffered. Holloway replied with disarming honesty. I want him to watch as everything he's built in this town crumbles. I want him to break his precious silence and beg for mercy before I kill him. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of Holloway's men entered, a young man perhaps only a few years older than Grace. Unlike the others, his eyes held a hint of uncertainty, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with his role. Mr. Holloway, the mayor and town council are assembled downstairs. The young man reported, Excellent, Thomas. Holloway stood straightening his jacket. Keep watch over our guest. I have a town to acquire. After Holloway limped out, the room fell into uncomfortable silence. Grace studied the young man called Thomas. Unlike the other hard-faced men in Holloway's employ, Thomas had the look of someone not yet fully corrupted, handsome in a boyish way, with sandy hair and hazel eyes that avoided meeting hers directly. You don't seem like the others, Grace observed after several minutes had passed. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Don't try to talk to me. How did you end up working for a man like Holloway? Thomas's jaw tightened, but he answered despite himself. Mr. Holloway gave me a chance when no one else would took me off the streets in St. Louis. And what does he have you do to repay that chance? Grace pressed. My job is to follow orders. Thomas replied, his voice hardening. Nothing more, even when those orders involve terrorizing innocent people. Thomas finally looked directly at her. There are no innocent people. Not in this world. Mr. Blackwood is innocent. Grace insisted. He's a good man who helps people. A bitter laugh escaped Thomas. Your precious watchmaker is a killer, one of the best. Or did you miss that part of the conversation? The war was 15 years ago, Grace said softly. People change. No. Thomas replied with certainty beyond his years. They just hide what they really are, until they can't anymore. Grace fell silent, turning her gaze to the window. From the hotel's second floor, she could see much of Whisper Creek's main street, now eerily empty in the wake of the shooting. Her eyes fixed on the small shop at the edge of town, where Solomon Blackwood had taught her the intricate art of clockwork for the past 2 years. She wondered what the old watchmaker was doing now. Planning a rescue, fleeing town. Or perhaps Thomas was right and Solomon Blackwood was preparing to become someone she had never known, the ghost hand of Union Army legend. Whatever was coming, Grace knew one thing with certainty in Whisper Creek time was no longer marked merely by the turning of clock hands, but by the inexorable approach of violence. Solomon Blackwood moved through his shop with methodical precision, gathering what he needed. The drawer beneath his workbench now lay open, revealing not just the holster and revolver, but a collection of tools that had nothing to do with watchmaking, a spyglass, a coil of thin wire, several small metal canisters, and a book of matches. Sheriff Maddox stood in the doorway, watching. Whatever you're planning, you need to know. Holloway's got at least 8 men, all armed, all experienced. Solomon nodded once, continuing his preparations. I've sent for help from Fort Laramie. Maddox continued, but they won't get here for at least 2 days, maybe 3. Solomon paused, then wrote on his notepad, Grace doesn't have 3 days. I know that Maddox said heavily, but a frontal assault on the hotel would be suicide, and it wouldn't help Grace. Solomon wrote again, not planning an assault. Then what? Instead of writing, Solomon pointed to the various clocks in his shop, then to his ear. Maddox's brow furrowed. I don't understand. Solomon sighed, then wrote more extensively. Holloway is precise, methodical. He'll have routines, schedules, need to watch. Listen, find the patterns. Understanding dawned on Maddox's face. You're going to study them before making a move. Solomon nodded. That still doesn't solve the problem of being outnumbered. Solomon's pen scratched across the paper. Numbers aren't everything. Maddox shook his head. They are when bullets start flying. He paused. You know, there are men in town who'd stand with you. Men who remember what it means to fight for something. Solomon stopped his preparations, fixing Maddox with a hard stare. He wrote deliberately, This is between Holloway and me. No one else dies for my past. It stopped being just about you the moment they took Grace and threatened the town. Maddox argued, Holloway's not just here for revenge. He's here to take everything. Solomon didn't respond, returning to his preparations. Finally, he secured the revolver in its holster and fastened it around his waist. The weapon should have looked out of place on the watchmaker, but instead it seemed to complete him, as if a missing piece had been restored. As darkness fell, Solomon made his way carefully toward the hotel, keeping to the shadows. The town was unnaturally quiet, its citizens locked behind doors and shuttered windows. Holloway's men had established patrols walking the streets in pairs, making their presence known. Solomon found a vantage point in the abandoned livery stable across from the hotel. From the hayloft window, he had a clear view of the hotel's front entrance and several of its second-floor windows. He settled in to watch the spyglass occasionally rising to his eye as he studied the movements of Holloway's men. Hour after hour, Solomon observed. He noted when guards changed positions, which windows showed light where men stationed themselves for maximum visibility. Occasionally, he made small marks in a notebook, recording times and patterns. Just before midnight, activity at the hotel increased. The front doors opened and Holloway emerged with 4 of his men heading toward the largest saloon down the street. Solomon tracked their movement through the spyglass, noting that only 3 men remained behind at the hotel, presumably guarding Grace. Minutes later, Sheriff Maddox appeared below the hayloft. Thought I'd find you here, he said quietly. Solomon didn't take his eyes from the spyglass. Holloway's been meeting with business owners all evening. Maddox reported, offering to buy them out for pennies on the dollar. Those who refuse are getting visited by his men later. He climbed the ladder to join Solomon in the loft. He's moving fast, consolidating power. By tomorrow, he'll own half the town. Solomon finally lowered the spyglass, turning to Maddox with a questioning look. No, the townspeople aren't just accepting it. Maddox answered the unspoken question, but they're scared that shooting demonstration worked exactly as he planned. Solomon nodded grimly and returned to his observation. What's your count? Maddox asked after a moment. Solomon held up 8 fingers. My count too, Maddox confirmed. Plus Holloway himself, though with that leg, he's not much in a fight. Solomon's expression suggested he didn't share that assessment. The young one, Maddox continued. The one called Thomas, he doesn't fit with the others. Keeps to himself, seems uncomfortable with the rough stuff. Solomon made a note in his book. I'm going to keep asking around town. Maddox said, moving back toward the ladder. See if I can find out anything else about Holloway's plans, what he really wants. Solomon's hand shot out, gripping Maddox's arm. He shook his head firmly. I know you think this is your fight, Maddox said, but it's my town too. Solomon released him, but wrote in his notebook, Holloway is watching you, be careful. Dawn broke over Whisper Creek, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that belied the tension gripping the town. Solomon had maintained his vigil through the night, recording the movements of Holloway's men with clockmaker's precision. As morning light strengthened, the hotel came to life. Solomon focused his spyglass on a second-floor window where a curtain had been drawn back. Grace stood there looking out over the town. She appeared unharmed but tired, her face drawn with worry. A movement behind Grace caught Solomon's attention. Thomas entered the frame, saying something to her. Grace nodded and stepped away from the window, the curtain falling back into place. Solomon waited until the morning patrols had completed their rounds, then made his way back to his shop. The streets were beginning to fill with townspeople going about their business, though the usual chatter and greetings were subdued, replaced by watchful glances and hurried movements. Inside his shop, Solomon reviewed his notes, formulating a plan. The hotel had 3 entrances, the main doors facing the street, a side entrance used primarily for deliveries, and a rear door near the kitchen. Each was guarded with additional men patrolling the perimeter. Grace was being kept in a second-floor room on the eastern side with at least 1 guard present at all times. Direct assault was impossible, but Solomon hadn't survived the war and 15 years on the frontier by relying on direct assault. A knock at the shop door interrupted his planning. Solomon quickly concealed his notes and moved to answer, his hand, instinctively, hovering near his holstered revolver. Sheriff Maddox stood outside, his face grim. "Holloway wants to see you," he said without preamble. "Sent me to bring you to the hotel. Says if you don't come voluntarily, his men will start shooting citizens at random until you do." Solomon's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. Solomon nodded, his eyes constantly scanning the streets, noting the positions of Holloway's men. "Whatever happens in there," Maddox said quietly, "know that there are folks ready to stand with you when the time comes." Solomon shot him a warning glance. "I haven't organized anything," Maddox assured him. "But people in this town aren't cowards. They're just waiting for someone to show them there's a chance." The hotel lobby was crowded when they arrived. Whisper Creek's prominent citizens stood in uncomfortable clusters, their conversations hushed and tense. Holloway's men were positioned strategically around the room, hands resting casually on holstered weapons. Cyrus Holloway himself stood at the base of the grand staircase, leaning on his cane. He wore another immaculate suit, his silver-streaked hair perfectly combed, his bearing, aristocratic despite his obvious disability. At Solomon's entrance, a predatory smile spread across his face. "Solomon Blackwood." He announced, his voice carrying easily over the murmured conversations, which died immediately. "The silent watchmaker of Whisper Creek. How kind of you to join us." All eyes turned to Solomon, who stood impassively just inside the entrance, Maddox at his side. "Many of your neighbors have expressed confusion about my interest in your humble town." Holloway continued addressing the gathered citizens, but keeping his eyes fixed on Solomon. "They wonder why a man of my resources would travel so far from civilization to invest in a frontier outpost." He descended the last step, moving toward the center of the lobby. "Allow me to clarify my intentions. Whisper Creek sits at a crucial junction for the coming railroad expansion. Those who control this land will control the future of commerce throughout the territory." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Holloway confirmed rumors that had circulated for months about a possible railroad connection. "My associates and I are prepared to offer generous compensation to current property owners." Holloway went on, "Those who cooperate will find themselves considerably wealthier. Those who resist—" He let the implication hang in the air. "You mean those who won't sell will find themselves dead?" Maddox interjected bluntly. Holloway's smile tightened. "Progress has always had its casualties, Sheriff." He turned back to the assembled townspeople. "But my presence here serves another purpose beyond mere business." With theatrical timing, Holloway raised his cane, pointing it directly at Solomon. "This man is not who you think he is. The quiet watchmaker you've welcomed into your community is actually Solomon Ghost Hand Blackwood, one of the most lethal killers of the war between the states." The revelation sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Some faces registered shock, others confusion, and a few, the older men who had themselves served in the war, showed dawning recognition. "Ghost Hand Blackwood." Holloway continued, his voice hardening. "The Union Army's angel of death, a man who could kill at impossible distances, who could draw and fire faster than human eyes could follow." He limped closer to Solomon, who remained motionless. "A man who ended dozens of lives during the war, and after a man who hides behind a facade of silence to avoid the judgment his actions deserve." "The war's been over for 15 years. Someone in the crowd called out, 'What's your point?' "My point." Holloway said, turning back to address the room, is that Whisper Creek has a viper in its midst, a killer masquerading as a craftsman, a wolf among sheep. His voice rose. And I am here to expose him for what he truly is, before he brings destruction upon you all. Solomon's expression never changed, but his eyes never left Holloway's face. Where's Grace Andrews? Maddox demanded, changing the subject. You promised she wouldn't be harmed. Miss Andrews is quite comfortable, Holloway assured him, gesturing toward the staircase. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs, guiding Grace down with a firm hand on her arm. She looked tired but uninjured, her eyes widening at the sight of Solomon. In fact, Holloway continued, I've invited her to witness this historic meeting. After all, she deserves to know the truth about the man she's been working for. Grace was brought to stand near Holloway, Thomas remaining close beside her. Tell me, Miss Andrews, Holloway said, his voice deceptively conversational. Did you know your employer was one of the most feared men of the war? That the sound of his name made brave men tremble, that mothers used stories of Ghost Hand, Blackwood to frighten disobedient children? Grace lifted her chin. Mr. Blackwood is a good man. Whatever he did during the war doesn't change that. Holloway's smile turned cold. Such loyalty, but then you never saw what he was capable of. He turned back to Solomon. Perhaps it's time for a demonstration. Time to show these good people exactly what kind of monster they've harbored in their community. He snapped his fingers, and one of his men stepped forward, holding a wooden box. Holloway opened it and removed a revolver, not the utilitarian weapons his men carried, but an ornate piece with pearl grips and silver engraving. This belonged to my brother. Holloway said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. Captain James Holloway of the Confederate Army. A gentleman and a scholar who answered his state's call to duty. He held the weapon reverently. Your ghost hand shot him through the heart at Antietam from a distance witnesses claimed was impossible. He never even saw the man who killed him. Solomon's face remained impassive. Nothing to say, Holloway taunted. No defense for your actions, no explanation for these good people. The lobby had gone deathly quiet, the tension palpable as everyone waited for Solomon's response. Finally, Solomon reached slowly for the notepad in his pocket. He wrote a single line and held it up for Holloway to read. Your brother was aiming at unarmed prisoners. Holloway's face contorted with rage. Lies, he spat. My brother was a man of honor. Solomon wrote again. Then why did you spend the war safely in Richmond while he fought? The barb struck home. Holloway's composure cracked his aristocratic veneer, giving way to naked hatred. Enough, he shouted. I didn't come here to debate the past with a mute killer. He gestured sharply to his men. Take him! Two of Holloway's men moved towards Solomon, drawing their weapons. Sheriff Maddox reached for his own gun, but froze when 3 more weapons turned in his direction. I wouldn't, Sheriff Holloway warned. Not unless you want to make your deputy the new sheriff today. Solomon made no move to resist as Holloway's men seized his arms, removing his revolver from its holster. His eyes remained fixed on Holloway, utterly calm, despite the rough handling. Take him upstairs, Holloway ordered. I want him to have time to contemplate what's coming. He turned to the assembled townspeople. The rest of you have until tomorrow morning to accept my offers for your properties. After that, the terms become significantly less generous. As Solomon was led toward the stairs, Grace suddenly broke free from Thomas's hold and rushed to Solomon's side. Mr. Blackwood, she said urgently, this isn't your fault. Whatever happens, remember that. One of Holloway's men roughly pulled her away. Solomon's expression finally changed, a flash of something dangerous crossing his features, before the mask of calm returned. How touching! Holloway mocked the loyal assistant defending the silent killer. He nodded to Thomas. Take Miss Andrews back to her room. Ensure she's comfortable but secure. As Solomon was led up the stairs, his eyes met Maddox's briefly. Some unspoken communication passed between them, and Maddox gave an almost imperceptible nod before turning to leave the hotel. Upstairs, Solomon was taken to a room at the end of the hallway, far from where Grace was being held. The room had been stripped of furniture, except for a single straight-back chair in the center. Solomon was forced into the chair, his hands bound behind him with rope. Mr. Holloway will be up to talk with you soon, one of the men said with a malicious grin. He's been waiting 15 years for this conversation. I'd start thinking about what you want your last words to be, assuming you can still speak at all. The door closed and locked, leaving Solomon alone in the sparsely furnished room. For several minutes he sat perfectly still, his breathing steady, his eyes focused on the wall opposite. Then slowly, methodically, he began testing the ropes binding his wrists. Grace paced the confines of her room. Mind racing through the window, she could see the sun beginning its westward descent. Whatever Holloway planned for Solomon, it would happen soon. A key turned in the lock, and Grace tensed, prepared to confront Holloway or one of his harder men. Instead, Thomas entered alone, carrying a tray with food and water. "Mr. Holloway thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on a small table. Grace made no move toward the food. "What is he going to do to Mr. Blackwood?" Thomas's eyes shifted away. "That's not my concern." "It should be," Grace insisted. "You're part of it now. Whatever happens to him, you helped how make it happen." "I follow orders," Thomas said mechanically, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is that what you tell yourself at night?" Grace challenged. "That you were just following orders when you helped terrorize innocent people. When you stood by while a good man was taken prisoner for crimes committed during a war that ended before you were even born." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're not like the others," Grace said, softening her tone. "I can see it in your eyes. You don't belong with men like that." "And where exactly do I belong?" Thomas asked bitterly. "The respectable world doesn't want people like me. Holloway took me in when I was starving on the streets, gave me purpose, a future." "A future as what? A thug, a killer?" Grace moved closer to him. "Is that really all you think you're good for?" Thomas took a step back. "You don't understand. Holloway saved my life. So he could use you," Grace countered, "just like he's using everyone. He doesn't care about you. Thomas, you're just another tool to him." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, doubt perhaps, or recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding. "Mr. Blackwood gave me a chance too," Grace continued, "after my parents died when I had nothing, but he never asked me to hurt anyone in return. That's the difference between a man who saves you because he sees value in you and a man who saves you because he sees use in you." Thomas looked away, his internal conflict evident. "It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. It's never too late to choose differently," Grace insisted, "to be better than what others expect of you." Before Thomas could respond, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. He quickly moved to the door. "Eat your food," he said, his voice returning to its professional detachment. "Mr. Holloway wants you healthy for what comes next." After Thomas left, Grace moved to the window, staring out at the town she'd called home for the past 2 years. Whisper Creek looked subdued, its streets emptier than usual, its citizens keeping to themselves as Holloway's men patrolled. Her eyes drifted to Solomon's shop at the edge of town. From this distance, it looked small and insignificant, just as its owner had always seemed to those who didn't look closely enough. But Grace had looked closely. She'd seen the precision in Solomon's hands that spoke of skills beyond watchmaking. She'd noticed how he always positioned himself to see entrances and exits, how his eyes tracked movement with unnatural awareness. Solomon Blackwood was more than he appeared. And if half of what Holloway claimed was true, he was far more dangerous than anyone in Whisper Creek had imagined. Yet in 2 years of working alongside him, Grace had never once felt afraid in his presence. She'd seen only kindness in his actions, only patience in his instruction, only fairness in his dealings with others. Whatever Ghost Hand Blackwood had been during the war, the man Grace knew was good, and she would not stand by while Holloway destroyed him. Down the hall in the bare room where Solomon was held, Cyrus Holloway finally made his entrance. He dismissed the guards, closing the door behind him, and stood looking down at his bound prisoner. 15 years, Holloway said softly. 15 years, I've dreamed of this moment, planned for it, lived for it. Solomon regarded him silently, his face betraying nothing. "Do you know what it's like to spend 15 years in prison?" "Ghost Hand," Holloway asked, limping slowly around the chair. "To feel your life slipping away day by day, hour by hour? To know that the man who put you there chose to leave you alive out of some perverted sense of mercy. He stopped directly in front of Solomon. You should have killed me that day. It would have been kinder than what you did. He tapped his cane against his crippled leg. This was never about mercy. It was about pride. You wanted me to live, knowing I'd been beaten by the legendary ghost hand. Solomon's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes followed Holloway's movements with cold calculation. Still nothing to say. Holloway leaned closer. No last words before I finish what you started 15 years ago. Solomon's silence seemed to infuriate Holloway more than any response could have. He straightened, regaining his composure with visible effort. You know I had such elaborate plans for how I'd make you suffer. Holloway continued, his tone conversational again. I thought about killing the girl in front of you, about burning this pathetic town to the ground while you watched, about breaking every bone in your body before finally ending your miserable existence. He smiled thinly. But I've realized something during my journey here. Something important about revenge. He leaned on his cane, studying Solomon's face. It's not about how much pain you inflict. It's about taking from your enemy the thing they value most. Holloway began circling the chair again. For 15 years, you've hidden behind your silence, made a life for yourself in this backwater, pretended to be nothing more than a simple craftsman. He stopped behind Solomon, leaning down to speak directly into his ear. Your silence is your shield, your protection, your penance for whatever sins you think you committed during the war. He moved back into Solomon's line of sight. So I won't kill you today. Ghost Hand, I won't harm your precious assistant. I won't even destroy this town, though I will own it, make no mistake. Holloway's smile widened. Instead, I'm going to take your silence. I'm going to make you speak, beg, plead, scream. I'm going to strip away the last protection you have from your past. And then when you've lost everything that makes your life bearable, when you're drowning in the memories of all the men you've killed and all the lives you've destroyed, then I'll consider us even. Solomon's eyes never wavered, showing neither fear nor anger. Still so controlled. Holloway observed, we'll see how long that lasts. He moved to the door, rapping on it with his cane. Bring in the equipment. He called. Two of his men entered, carrying a wooden crate, which they set on the floor before departing. Holloway opened it, removing several items that he arranged on the windowsill. A set of pliers, several knives of various sizes, a small metal rod, and a bottle of clear liquid. Prison teaches a man many things. Holloway commented, examining one of the knives. Pain, for instance, how to endure it, how to inflict it, the precise point at which a man will say anything, do anything to make it stop. He selected the metal rod and bottle, turning back to Solomon. These next few hours will be educational for both of us, I think. As Holloway approached with his implements of torture, Solomon's face remained impassive, but deep in his eyes something shifted. A decision made, a line crossed. For the first time since Holloway had entered the room, Solomon's gaze broke away, moving to the window where the setting sun cast long shadows across Whisper Creek. Holloway followed his gaze. Worried about the town? The girl don't be. They'll survive what's coming. They might even thrive under proper management. He turned back to Solomon with the rod in his hand. You, on the other hand. The door burst open, suddenly startling both men. Thomas stood in the doorway, breathing hard. Mr. Holloway, sir, there's trouble. Holloway's face darkened. I gave explicit instructions not to be disturbed. It's the sheriff, sir, Thomas explained hurriedly. He's gathered men at the jailhouse. They're armed and talking about storming the hotel. How many? At least 15, maybe more, joining them. Holloway cursed under his breath. Fools, they'll get themselves killed. He glanced at Solomon, frustration evident in his expression. Gather the men in the lobby. We'll make an example of the sheriff and his would-be heroes. He pointed the metal rod at Solomon. Don't go anywhere, he said with bitter humor. We'll continue our conversation when I've dealt with this minor insurrection. After Holloway left, the room fell silent, except for the ticking of a small clock on the windowsill, one of the items from Holloway's crate of tools. Solomon sat perfectly still, eyes closed as if in meditation, his breathing slow and measured. Minutes passed. The sun continued its descent, the shadows in the room lengthening. Solomon opened his eyes, focusing on the clock. Its ticking seemed to grow louder in the empty room, marking time with mechanical precision. Outside, raised voices could be heard from the direction of the jailhouse. Holloway's men had taken positions on the hotel porch, and in the street, weapons ready. Sheriff Maddox and a group of townsfolk stood opposite them, creating a tense standoff in the center of Whisper Creek. The clock on the windowsill continued its steady rhythm, tick-tock, tick-tock. Solomon's eyes never left it, watching, as if expecting something. Precisely as the minute hand reached the 12, marking the half hour, Solomon moved with a sudden, powerful flex of his shoulders and arms. He strained against the ropes binding him. The chair creaked but held. Solomon relaxed his breathing, still controlled. His eyes returned to the clock, watching its inexorable progress. When the minute hand reached the next quarter hour, he strained again, more violently this time. The chair groaned, one of its joints cracking audibly. Down the hall, Grace pressed her ear to her door, listening to the guard outside. She had heard the commotion downstairs, the sound of men gathering and leaving. Now only a single set of footsteps paced the hallway. The door to her room opened, suddenly making her jump back. Thomas entered, his face tense. "Come with me," he said quietly. "Now before I change my mind." Grace stared at him, hardly daring to hope. "You're letting me go?" "I'm trying to do the right thing," Thomas replied, voice strained. "For once in my life. But we have to hurry." He led her into the hallway, checking that it was clear before guiding her toward the back stairs. "Most of the men are out front dealing with the sheriff. There's only one guard on Blackwood's room." "We have to help him," Grace insisted. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." They moved silently down the hall toward Solomon's room. The guard outside straightened as they approached, hand moving to his gun. Before he could draw, Thomas stepped forward with surprising speed, delivering a sharp blow to the man's temple that dropped him unconscious. "Where did you learn that?" Grace asked, startled. "St. Louis wasn't kind to orphans," Thomas replied grimly, taking the guard's keys. He unlocked the door, pushing it open cautiously. Inside, they found Solomon in the midst of another attempt to break free. The chair legs splintered under the strain, and Solomon crashed to the floor, still bound, but no longer secured to the chair. "Mr. Blackwood." Grace rushed to his side while Thomas quickly cut the ropes with a knife taken from the unconscious guard. Solomon rose to his feet, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had cut into them. His eyes locked with Thomas's, evaluating, measuring. "I'm switching sides," Thomas explained quickly. "Miss Andrews made me realize some things about Holloway, about myself." Solomon nodded once, accepting the explanation without question. He moved to the windowsill, collecting the clock Holloway had left there. "We need to get out of here," Thomas urged. "There's a back staircase that leads to the kitchen. We can slip out while everyone's focused on the standoff out front." Solomon shook his head. He pointed to the clock in his hand, then gestured down the hall in the direction of the front stairs. "What is he saying?" Thomas asked Grace. "He wants to go toward the confrontation, not away from it." Grace translated, "Something about the clock." Solomon nodded, writing quickly on a small notepad he pulled from his pocket. "Need to get to my shop." "Have a plan." "Need both of you." Thomas looked uncertain, but Grace nodded immediately. "Whatever you need, Mr. Blackwood. We're with you." The Solomon's eyes crinkled slightly, his version of a smile. He led them into the hall, not toward the back stairs, as Thomas had suggested, but toward a window at the end of the corridor. Opening it, he pointed to the roof of the adjacent building, just a short jump away. Thomas went first, helping Grace across. After him, Solomon followed, moving with an agility that belied his age. Together, they made their way across the rooftops, eventually dropping into an alley behind the general store. From there, Solomon led them through back streets and service alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfare, where Holloway's men were still engaged in the standoff with Sheriff Maddox and the townsfolk. Finally, they reached the watchmaker's shop. Solomon unlocked the door and ushered them inside, immediately moving to his workbench. "What now?" Thomas asked, still nervous about their escape. "Holloway will tear the town apart looking for us once he realizes we're gone." Solomon didn't answer, focused entirely on the clock he'd taken from the hotel room. With practiced hands, he opened the casing, exposing the internal mechanism. To Grace's surprise, he began modifying it, adding small components from his workbench. "What is he doing?" Thomas wondered aloud. Grace watched, fascinated. "Whatever it is, trust him. Mr. Blackwood knows what he's doing." Solomon worked for several minutes, his modifications precise and deliberate. When he finished, he closed the clock casing and wound it carefully. Then he moved to the bottom drawer of his workbench, removing the holster and revolver Holloway's men had confiscated earlier. "They took your gun," Thomas pointed out. Solomon shook his head, opening a hidden compartment in the floor beneath his workbench. Inside lay a second revolver, identical to the first, along with additional ammunition and the tools he had gathered the previous night. As Solomon prepared his equipment, voices from outside grew louder. The standoff was escalating. Thomas moved to the window, peering cautiously through the dusty glass. "Holloway's threatening to start shooting if the sheriff doesn't back down," he reported. "Maddox is holding firm, but some of the townspeople look like they're losing their nerve." Solomon nodded as if this was exactly what he expected. He wrote on his notepad, showing it to both Grace and Thomas. "Need to divide Holloway's forces. Draw them away from civilians. Thomas, take this to Sheriff Maddox." He handed Thomas a folded note and the modified clock. "What does it do?" Thomas asked, looking at the clock with suspicion. Solomon wrote again. "Distraction, tell Maddox. When clock strikes 8, be ready to move people to safety." Thomas nodded, tucking the note and clock carefully into his jacket. "What about you two?" Solomon wrote once more. "Grace stays here. I go after Holloway." "Alone," Grace protested. "That's suicide." Solomon's expression softened as he looked at her. He wrote, "Not alone, never alone again." The simple statement carried a weight that silenced Grace's objections. She nodded, understanding something. Thomas didn't, that Solomon Blackwood had been alone with his ghost for 15 years, and that silence had been his only companion. "I'll get this to Maddox," Thomas promised. "And then I'll come back. You might need another gun." Solomon considered this, then wrote, "Back door, 10 minutes. Be careful, Holloway's men know your face now." After Thomas slipped out, Grace turned to Solomon. "What's your plan, really?" Solomon hesitated, then wrote more extensively than she'd ever seen. "Holloway wants me to speak, to beg to break my silence. That's his real goal, more than revenge, more than money. He needs to hear me admit defeat." "Why is that so important to him?" Grace asked. Solomon wrote again. "Because silence is power, has been since that day, 15 years ago when I chose not to kill him. My silence reminds him of that mercy every day, of his failure." Grace considered this. "So what will you do?" Solomon's answer was simple. "Speak, but on my terms, not his." He gathered his equipment, the revolver, the wire, the small metal canisters and other tools whose purpose Grace couldn't guess. As he prepared to leave, Grace placed a hand on his arm. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "Solomon, whatever happens, I'm proud to know you." Solomon paused, looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. A mixture of gratitude, resolution, and something that might have been regret. Then he was gone, slipping out the front door into the gathering darkness of Whisper Creek's most dangerous night. In the street, the confrontation was reaching its breaking point. Sheriff Maddox stood firm, backed by townspeople armed with everything from shotguns to pitchforks. Opposite them, Holloway's men had created a defensive line, weapons drawn. Cyrus Holloway himself stood on the hotel porch, watching the standoff with growing impatience. "This is your final warning. Sheriff," he called out, "disperse your mob or we start shooting." Maddox didn't budge. "We're not the ones threatening innocent people. Holloway, release Miss Andrews and leave our town. That's the only way this ends peacefully." "Peaceful endings are overrated," Holloway replied coldly. "Sometimes blood needs to be spilled for progress to occur." He raised his hand, preparing to give the order to fire, when Thomas appeared at the edge of the crowd, working his way toward Sheriff Maddox. Sheriff Thomas called out loud enough for Holloway to hear. "I've got a message from Solomon Blackwood." Holloway's head snapped around at the sound of Thomas's voice. "You," he snarled, recognizing his young henchman among the opposition. "Treacherous dog." Thomas ignored him, pressing the note and clock into Maddox's hands. He whispered something to the sheriff, whose eyes widened momentarily before his face settled into grim determination. "What's this?" Holloway demanded, limping down the hotel steps. "What game is Ghost Hand playing now?" "No game, Holloway," Maddox replied. "Just a man who's tired of your kind bringing violence where it isn't wanted." Holloway's face twisted with rage. "Where is he? Where's Blackwood?" He turned to his men. "Search the hotel, find him and the girl." As his men scrambled to obey, Holloway turned back to Maddox. "You're harboring a killer, Sheriff, a man with more blood on his hands than anyone in this territory." "The war's been over for 15 years, Maddox responded evenly. "Whatever Blackwood did then, he's paid for it with 15 years of peace. Can you say the same?" Holloway's laugh was bitter. "Peace? Is that what you call hiding from your nature? Bearing your true self beneath a veneer of respectability?" He shook his head. "No, Sheriff, men like Ghost Hand don't change. They just wait for the right moment to reveal themselves." One of Holloway's men came running from the hotel. "They're gone, sir, Blackwood and the girl, and Peterson's unconscious. Looks like someone jumped him." Holloway's rage boiled over. "Find them," he shouted. "Search every building, every alley I want. Blackwood brought to me alive." He turned back to the townspeople. "And as for you, loyal citizens of Whisper Creek, consider this demonstration of what happens to those who defy progress." He raised his gun, aiming not at Maddox, but at one of the shopkeepers in the crowd, a man who had refused to sell earlier that day. Before he could fire, a single shot rang out. Holloway's gun flew from his hand, spinning through the air before clattering to the ground several feet away. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as all eyes turned to the source of the shot. Solomon Blackwood stood alone in the middle of the street, 50 yards away, revolver still raised. The shot had been perfect, striking Holloway's weapon without touching the man himself. Ghost Hand. Holloway breathed a mixture of hatred and something like satisfaction crossing his features. "We finally decided to come out of hiding." Solomon lowered his gun slowly, but didn't holster it. He began walking forward, his gait measured and deliberate, his eyes never leaving Holloway's face. "Kill him," Holloway ordered his men, who raised their weapons. "Wait," Maddox shouted. "Look at the clock." The modified clock in Maddox's hand began to chime. Though it was not yet 8 o'clock, at the sound, small explosions erupted throughout the town. Not destructive blasts, but carefully placed noisemakers that Solomon had been positioning during the previous night's reconnaissance. Confusion spread through Holloway's men as the noise seemed to come from all directions. Taking advantage of the distraction, Maddox quickly moved the townspeople to cover. "Get back," he urged. "Take shelter in the stores." Holloway's men fired wildly at the sources of the explosions, further adding to the chaos. Solomon continued his steady advance, moving from cover to cover with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years navigating battlefields. In the confusion, no one noticed Thomas slip away from the crowd, circling back toward the watchmaker's shop. Where Grace waited, Solomon had closed half the distance to Holloway when the first of the genuine gunfights broke out. One of Holloway's more trigger-happy men opened fire on a shadow, and Maddox's deputies returned fire. Within seconds, the street was filled with gun smoke and the crack of weapons. Holloway, seeing his carefully orchestrated confrontation descending into chaos, bellowed for order. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire, you idiots!" But it was too late. The violence had been unleashed. Taking advantage of the disorder, Solomon made his final approach. He appeared almost supernaturally calm amid the gunfire, his movements precise and economical, never exposing himself unnecessarily. Holloway, realizing his vulnerability, limped back toward the hotel entrance, shouting for his men to cover him. But they were scattered now, engaged in individual firefights, no longer a coordinated force. As Solomon reached the hotel steps, Holloway turned to face him, hatred burning in his eyes. "Come to finish it, Ghost Hand. Come to end what you started 15 years ago." Solomon's expression remained unreadable as he climbed the steps, revolver still in hand, but pointed at the ground. Holloway backed into the hotel lobby, drawing a derringer from his vest pocket. "I've waited 15 years for this moment." He said, his voice shaking with emotion. 15 years dreaming of the day I'd watch you die. Solomon stopped at the top of the steps framed in the doorway. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, enemies bound by a history of violence and a future that would be decided in the next few moments. "Say something, damn you," Holloway shouted, raising the derringer. "Break your cursed silence before I send you to hell." Solomon's lips parted. After 15 years of perfect silence, he spoke, his voice rough from disuse, but clear in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the lobby. "Cyrus," he said simply, "enough." The shock of hearing Solomon speak seemed to freeze Holloway momentarily. In that instant of hesitation, Solomon moved with the speed that had earned him his wartime name. His hand was a blur as he drew and fired in one fluid motion. The derringer flew from Holloway's grasp, but unlike Solomon's earlier shot, this one took two of Holloway's fingers with it. Holloway screamed in pain and rage, clutching his wounded hand to his chest. Solomon approached steadily, his gun trained on Holloway's chest. 15 years ago," he said, his voice gaining strength, "I spared your life because I thought the war had seen enough death. Because I believed even a man like you deserved the chance to change." Holloway, despite his pain, laughed bitterly. "Change? You crippled me and called it mercy. I stopped you from killing an innocent family." Solomon corrected, his voice carrying an authority that filled the room. "A woman and 3 children whose only crime was helping wounded Union soldiers. They were traitors to the Confederacy." Holloway spat. "They were human beings." Solomon replied quietly, "Something you've never understood." Outside, the gunfire had mostly ceased. Sheriff Maddox appeared in the doorway, behind Solomon, his own weapon drawn. Several of Holloway's men were being rounded up by townspeople and deputies. "It's over, Cyrus," Solomon continued. "Your men are surrendering. Your plan has failed. Whatever revenge you sought, you won't find it here." Holloway's face contorted with hatred. "It's not over until I say it's over." Ido, with surprising speed for a man with his disability, he lunged forward, drawing a hidden knife from his boot with his uninjured hand. Solomon sidestepped the attack easily, but did not fire. Instead, he struck Holloway's arm with precisely calculated force, causing the knife to drop from nerveless fingers. A second blow sent Holloway sprawling to the floor. Standing over his fallen enemy, Solomon holstered his weapon. 15 years ago, I chose mercy," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now crowded lobby as townspeople and deputies gathered to witness the confrontation's end. "Today I make the same choice." He turned to Sheriff Maddox. "He's all yours, Sheriff. I believe the territorial court will be interested in the attempted murder of a law officer among other charges." Maddox nodded, stepping forward to secure Holloway, who lay defeated on the floor. His grand schemes of revenge and empire building collapsed around him. As Solomon turned to leave, Holloway's voice, thick with hatred, stopped him. "This doesn't end here, Ghost Hand. There's no prison built that can hold me forever. Someday I'll finish what we started." Solomon looked back at his fallen enemy, and for the first time, genuine pity showed in his expression. "That's the difference between us, Cyrus. For you, nothing ever ends. The war, the hatred, the need for revenge, they'll follow you to your grave." He started walking away, then paused, adding quietly, "For me, they ended the moment I chose to put down my gun and pick up a watchmaker's tools instead." With those words, Solomon Blackwood walked out of the hotel into the night air of Whisper Creek, leaving 15 years of silence behind him. Dawn broke over Whisper Creek, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that belied the violence of the previous night. Solomon Blackwood sat on the porch of his shop, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. For the first time in 15 years, his shoulders seemed unburdened, his posture more open. Grace emerged from inside the shop where she'd spent the night after the chaos had finally subsided. She took a seat beside him, her own cup cradled between her palms. "How does it feel?" she asked softly. "To speak again after so long?" Solomon considered the question, sipping his coffee before answering. "Strange," he said, his voice still rough, but growing stronger with use. "Like putting on an old coat you'd forgotten you owned." Grace smiled at the simple but apt comparison. "Will you keep talking now, or go back to silence?" "Haven't decided," Solomon replied. Silence became comfortable. Safe. He glanced at her. But perhaps I've been safe long enough. The street before them was unusually quiet for morning. Many of Whisper Creek's citizens were still in their homes processing the events of the night. Holloway and his surviving men had been locked in the jail, awaiting transport to the territorial court. 3 of Holloway's gang had died in the gunfight, along with one of Maddox's deputies and a shopkeeper who'd been caught in the crossfire. "I'm sorry about Deputy Collins," Grace said, following Solomon's gaze toward the jailhouse. "And Mr. Peterson." Solomon nodded grimly. Violence always has its cost, even when necessary. Sheriff Maddox appeared down the street, making his way toward Solomon's shop. He moved with the weariness of a man who hadn't slept, his face drawn, with fatigue but resolute. "Morning." He greeted them, climbing the steps to join them on the porch. "Town council's meeting at noon. Thought you might want to be there." Solomon raised an eyebrow questioningly. "They're discussing what to do about Holloway's property acquisitions," Maddox explained. "Turns out most of the deeds he claimed to have bought were never properly transferred. His ownership of half the town was smoke and mirrors, legal threats backed by gunmen, not actual paperwork." "That's good news," Grace said. "The rightful owners can keep their properties." Maddox nodded. "There's also the matter of the railroad connection. Holloway wasn't lying about that part. The territorial governor confirmed it this morning by telegraph. The railroad is coming, and Whisper Creek needs to decide how to handle it." Solomon considered this information. "Progress comes whether we want it or not," he observed. "The difference is in how we shape it." Maddox's eyebrows rose slightly at hearing Solomon speak, but he recovered quickly. "That's what I told the council. They'd like to hear your thoughts too, considering you've become something of a town hero overnight." Solomon shook his head dismissively. "Not a hero, just a man settling an old debt." "Maybe," Maddox conceded, "but the way folks see it, you saved the town from being taken over by an Eastern carpetbagger with delusions of grandeur." He sipped the coffee. Grace offered him, words spreading about Ghost Hand, Blackwood coming out of retirement to defend a frontier town. "You might find yourself with more attention than you've wanted these past 15 years. The implications weren't lost on Solomon. His carefully constructed anonymity was gone. The past he'd tried to leave behind had caught up with him in spectacular fashion. "What will you do now?" Grace asked, voicing the question hanging in the air. Before Solomon could answer, Thomas appeared at the edge of the property, hesitating uncertainly. The young man looked as if he'd slept even less than Maddox. His clothes rumpled his face. Haggard, Maddox's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "Easy, Sheriff," Solomon said quietly. "The boy made his choice last night, a good one." With a nod from Solomon, Thomas approached, climbing the steps to join them on the porch. "Came to say goodbye," he said, his voice subdued. "Figure it's best I move on. Too many folks here have reason to hold a grudge." "Where will you go?" Grace asked. Thomas shrugged. "West, maybe California? Somewhere I can start fresh." Solomon studied the young man thoughtfully. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and extracted a folded piece of paper, which he handed to Thomas. "What's this?" Thomas asked, unfolding it. "Letter of introduction." Solomon replied, "To an old friend in San Francisco, watchmaker, always looking for apprentices with steady hands." Thomas stared at the letter in disbelief. "Why would you help me after everything?" "Everyone deserves a second chance," Solomon said simply. "The question is what you do with it." Thomas swallowed hard, nodding his gratitude as he carefully tucked the letter into his shirt pocket. "I won't waste it," he promised. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." As Thomas descended the steps, Solomon called after him. "One more thing." Thomas turned back. "A man's past doesn't define him," Solomon said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "His choices do." After Thomas departed, Maddox rose to leave as well. Noon at the town hall, he reminded Solomon, "Though I suspect you'll be busy with visitors before then, word travels fast in a small town." Indeed, as Maddox predicted, the morning brought a steady stream of townspeople to Solomon's porch. Some came with questions about his past, others with gratitude for his actions the previous night, and a few with timepieces that still needed repair, as if to signal that despite everything that had changed, some things remained constant. Solomon received them all with the same quiet dignity that had marked his 15 years of silence. Though now he spoke sparingly, when necessary, Grace remained by his side, helping to manage the unexpected flood of attention. By noon, when it was time for the town council meeting, Solomon had spoken more words than he had in the previous decade and a half combined. As he and Grace walked toward the town hall, he paused, looking back at his shop at the edge of town. Thinking of leaving, Grace asked perceptively. Solomon nodded. Crossed my mind. Hard to go back to anonymity after last night. Where would you go? West maybe, he echoed Thomas's earlier words with a hint of irony. Or north to Montana, somewhere quiet. Grace was silent for a moment before asking, would you go alone? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Solomon looked at her, seeing not just the young woman who had been his assistant for 2 years, but a person who had faced danger without flinching, who had shown courage and loyalty when it mattered most. That would depend, he said carefully, on whether anyone wanted to come along. Grace smiled. I think someone might. The town hall was packed when they arrived. Every seat was filled with additional townspeople standing along the walls. The mayor, a portly man named Simmons, called the meeting to order, as Solomon and Grace found places at the back of the room. Citizens of Whisper Creek. Simmons began. We face unprecedented challenges and opportunities in the wake of recent events. The railroad's planned extension through our town promises economic growth beyond anything we've imagined. But we must ensure that this progress benefits all our citizens, not just outside interests. The discussion that followed was lively, with various business owners and property holders expressing both hopes and concerns about the coming changes. Solomon listened attentively, but did not speak, content to observe the democratic process unfolding before him. Near the end of the meeting, however, the mayor called on him directly. Mr. Blackwood, given your unique perspective on our recent troubles, we'd value your thoughts on how the town should proceed. All eyes turned to Solomon, who looked momentarily uncomfortable with the attention. After a thoughtful pause, he rose to address the gathering. I'm no expert on progress or railroads. He began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the hushed room. But I know something about choices and their consequences. He surveyed the faces watching him. 15 years ago, I chose silence because I believed my voice had caused enough damage in this world. I chose to create rather than destroy, to mend rather than break. He gestured around the room. What you build here with this opportunity will outlast all of us. Choose wisely between what merely brings wealth and what brings lasting value. As Solomon resumed his seat, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The mayor thanked him, and the meeting continued with renewed focus on sustainable development and community protection. Afterward, as the townspeople dispersed, Sheriff Maddox approached Solomon and Grace outside the town hall. That was well said, he commented. Though I suspect public speaking isn't your favorite activity. Solomon's slight grimace confirmed Maddox's assessment. I've received word from Fort Laramie. Maddox continued, his tone becoming more serious. They're sending soldiers tomorrow to transport Holloway to the territorial prison. But there's something you should know. He lowered his voice. Holloway's been raving all night, making threats, swearing vengeance. Not surprising, Solomon replied. Defeat doesn't sit well with men like him. This is more than just talk, Maddox warned. He claims to have men waiting, men who weren't with him in town. Says they'll come for you if anything happens to him. Grace looked alarmed, but Solomon remained calm. Could be bluffing, he suggested, trying to salvage some control. Maybe, Maddox conceded, but I thought you should know. After Maddox left, Grace turned to Solomon. Do you think he's telling the truth about having more men out there? Solomon considered the question. Possible. Holloway was meticulous. Always had contingency plans during the war. He looked toward the distant hills that surrounded Whisper Creek. We should be prepared just in case. That evening, Solomon and Grace returned to the watchmaker's shop, which felt smaller somehow after the events of the past 2 days, as if the world had expanded around it, making what once seemed sufficient now feel confined. Solomon resumed work on a pocket watch he'd left unfinished before Holloway's arrival, his hands moving with their customary precision. Grace watched him, noting how the familiar routine seemed to soothe him. "It's strange," she observed after a while, "how quickly things return to normal, or at least the appearance of normal." Solomon nodded without looking up from his work. People need that. The comfort of routine. Especially after violence. "Is that why you became a watchmaker?" For the routine. Solomon's hands paused. He set down his tools and looked at Grace. "Partly," he admitted, "there's order in clockwork, predictability. Everything has a purpose, a place." He gestured to the gears laid out on his workbench. Unlike war, where chaos rules and purpose gets lost in blood and smoke. It was the most he'd said about his past since breaking his silence. Grace sensed the significance and didn't press further. As night fell, Solomon insisted on taking the first watch while Grace rested. Despite Maddox posting deputies near the shop, Solomon wasn't taking chances. He sat by the window, revolver within reach, watching the moonlit street with the vigilance that had kept him alive through countless battles. Around midnight, Grace awoke and joined him at the window. "You should sleep," she urged. "I can watch for a while." Solomon shook his head. "Not tired." "Liar," Grace said with gentle affection. "You haven't slept properly in days." A small smile touched Solomon's lips. "Habit from the war. Sleep light, wake ready." Grace sat beside him. "The war's been over for 15 years, Solomon. Even soldiers get to rest eventually." "Some ghosts don't rest," he replied softly, his eyes scanning the street. "They just wait for moments of weakness." Grace understood he wasn't speaking only of Holloway's potential reinforcements, but of the memories that had driven him to 15 years of silence. "What happened?" she asked carefully. "Before you came to Whisper Creek, Holloway mentioned your silence being a choice, not a necessity." Solomon was quiet for so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "After the war, I hunted deserters and war criminals for the Army. Tracked Holloway for months after reports came in about homesteaders being killed along the frontier, families murdered for their land or just for sport." He continued, watching the street as he spoke, as if the distance of his gaze allowed him to maintain distance from the memories. "Found him in Nebraska. He'd taken over a homestead, killed. The husband was holding the wife and children hostage. I could have killed him from a distance had the shot, but I wanted him to face justice, not just die." Solomon's hand unconsciously touched his holstered revolver. "Shot his knee instead, took him alive. But while I was securing him, the woman grabbed his hidden knife, tried to kill him herself in the struggle." His voice faltered. "The children saw everything. Their mother dying. The violence. The blood." Grace reached out, placing her hand over his. "It wasn't your fault. I made a choice." Solomon continued as if he hadn't heard her. "Believed capturing him alive was better than killing him cleanly. My choice cost that woman her life, left those children orphaned." He finally looked at Grace. "After that, words seemed inadequate. Empty, so I stopped using them. And became a watchmaker." Grace completed the story. "To create order from chaos?" Solomon nodded. "To make something that helps rather than harms." The confession hung in the air between them, the weight of it palpable in the small shop. Grace's hand remained on his, a silent affirmation of understanding. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me, for trusting me with that." Solomon's response was interrupted by a sound from outside, a soft, distinctive whistle that cut through the night air. His posture changed instantly, tension flooding back into his frame as he moved away from the window, drawing his revolver. "What is it?" Grace whispered, alarmed by his sudden shift. "Signal whistle," Solomon replied tersely. "Military 3, short 1 long, Holloway's men." Almost before the words were out of his mouth, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Bullets shattered the shop windows, sending glass exploding inward. Solomon tackled Grace to the floor, shielding her from the debris, as rounds tore through the shop's wooden walls. "Back door," Solomon ordered, keeping low. "Move." They crawled across the floor as bullets continued to pepper the building. Reaching the back room, Solomon paused at the door, checking through a small window before motioning Grace through. Outside, the night had erupted into chaos. Lights were coming on throughout Whisper Creek as citizens were awakened by the gunfire. Sheriff Maddox and his deputies were returning fire from defensive positions, but they were clearly outnumbered and outflanked. "How many?" Grace asked as they took cover behind a water trough in the alley. Solomon peered around the corner, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. "At least a dozen well-armed military training." His expression was grim. Holloway wasn't bluffing. These aren't common bandits. A bullet splintered the wood near Solomon's head, forcing him back into cover. "They've got us pinned," he muttered. "Need to reach Maddox coordinate defense." Grace pointed to a narrow space between buildings. "That alley connects to the main street. We could." Her suggestion was cut short by a massive explosion that rocked the ground beneath them. Fire bloomed from the direction of the jailhouse, illuminating the night sky with ominous orange light. "They're breaking Holloway out," Solomon realized aloud. "The attack on the shop is a diversion." Another explosion followed, smaller than the first but still powerful enough to shake the ground. Gunfire intensified near the jailhouse. Solomon's face hardened with decision. "Grace, listen carefully. I need you to make your way to the church. It's solid, stone defensible. Most of the townspeople will head there for shelter. Help Maddox organize them." "What about you?" Grace demanded, though she suspected the answer. "I'm going after Holloway," Solomon replied, checking his revolver. "This ends tonight. I'm coming with you." Grace insisted. Solomon shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. These men are killers." Grace, professional soldiers, turned mercenary. "I'm not asking permission," Grace said, her tone matching his, in determination. "You taught me more than just watchmaking these past 2 years, Solomon. You taught me about precision, patience, focus." Her eyes held his, "about doing what's necessary even when it's difficult." Solomon studied her face, seeing the resolve there. After a moment, he nodded once, acknowledging her choice with respect. "Stay close," he instructed. "Do exactly as I say. If I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." Grace nodded her agreement, and together they began making their way through the back alleys of Whisper Creek, heading toward the burning jailhouse. The sounds of battle grew louder as they approached. Gunfire, shouted orders, the screams of the wounded. They paused at the edge of an alley that opened onto the main street, surveying the chaos before them. The jailhouse was engulfed in flames, its wooden structure feeding the inferno. Bodies lay in the street, both townspeople and attackers. Sheriff Maddox and several deputies had taken cover behind an overturned wagon, exchanging fire with Holloway's men, who had established positions on both sides of the street. And there in the center of the destruction stood Cyrus Holloway himself. He had traded his elegant suit for practical trail clothes, though he still leaned heavily on his cane. One hand was bandaged from where Solomon's bullet had taken his fingers. He was shouting orders, directing his men with the authority of a military commander. "We can't take all of them," Grace whispered, counting at least 8 armed men still actively fighting. Solomon's eyes never left Holloway. "Don't need to," he replied. "Cut off the head, the body dies." He reached into his pocket, extracting a small metal object that Grace recognized from his workbench, a modified watch mechanism attached to what looked like a miniature flare. "When I give the signal," Solomon instructed, "create a distraction on the far side of the street, then get to the church as fast as you can." Grace wanted to protest, to insist on staying with him, but the look in Solomon's eyes stopped her. This was Ghost Hand. Blackwood now, the precision shooter, the tactical fighter who had survived countless battles. She nodded her understanding. Solomon handed her the device. "Pull this pin count to 3, throw it as far as you can toward that water tower." He pointed to the tall structure at the far end of the street. "Then run, don't look back." With a final nod, Solomon melted into the shadows, circling to approach Holloway from behind. Grace waited until he was in position, then pulled the pin on the device as instructed. She counted slowly, then threw it with all her strength toward the water tower. The resulting explosion was small but spectacular. A brilliant flash, followed by a shower of sparks that illuminated the entire street like daylight for several seconds. Holloway's men instinctively turned toward the new threat, momentarily distracted from their primary targets. Grace didn't wait to see what happened next. Following Solomon's instructions, she ran toward the church, keeping to the shadows, as he had taught her over the past 2 days. Behind her, gunfire erupted anew, punctuated by shouts of alarm and confusion. Solomon used the distraction to close the final distance to Holloway. Moving with the silent efficiency that had earned him his wartime nickname, he approached from behind, revolver drawn. "Cyrus," he called, his voice carrying over the chaos of battle. Holloway spun around, surprisingly quick despite his bad leg. His eyes widened at the sight of Solomon standing less than 10 feet away, weapon aimed directly at his chest. "Ghost hand," Holloway sneered. Recovering quickly from his surprise, "Come to finish what you started." "It's over, Cyrus," Solomon stated flatly. "Call off your men." Holloway laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. "Over? This is far from over." He gestured to the burning buildings, the gunfight still raging along the street. "Look around you, Ghost Hand. This is what you bring wherever you go. Death, destruction, chaos. That's your doing, not mine," Solomon countered. "I offered you mercy, once I'm offering it again. Surrender, and this madness before more people die." Something shifted in Holloway's expression, a momentary calculation, a weighing of options. Then his face hardened with resolve. "Never!" He spat with surprising speed. He drew a hidden revolver from within his coat. Solomon fired first. His bullet struck Holloway's shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Holloway returned fire wildly, his shots going wide as he struggled to maintain his balance. Taking cover behind a water trough, Solomon called out once more, "Last chance, Cyrus, surrender." Holloway's answer was another shot, this one splintering the wood near Solomon's head. 15 years I waited," Holloway shouted, his voice edged with madness. 15 years planning how I'd watch you suffer. I won't let you cheat me again with your false mercy." Around them, the battle was shifting. Several of Holloway's men had fallen, and Sheriff Maddox was rallying the townspeople, pushing back against the remaining attackers. The odds were turning against Holloway, and from his expression he knew it. With a cry of rage and desperation, Holloway charged Solomon's position, firing repeatedly. Solomon rolled clear of the water trough just as Holloway's bullets tore through it, sending water cascading across the dusty street. Coming up in a shooter's crouch, Solomon took careful aim at his advancing enemy. Time seemed to slow as he exhaled, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot, when it came, was precise and devastating, striking Holloway's good leg, shattering the knee just as he had 15 years before. Holloway collapsed with a howl of pain and fury, his gun skittering away across the muddy ground. Solomon approached cautiously, keeping his weapon trained on the fallen man. "It's finished, Cyrus," Solomon said quietly. "Your men are being routed. The town stands. Whatever vengeance you sought, you failed to find it." Holloway glared up at him, face contorted with hatred despite his pain. "Kill me then," he challenged. "Finish it. Prove that your precious mercy was nothing but weakness all along." Solomon studied the man before him, broken, defeated, consumed by a hatred that had festered for 15 years. In Holloway's eyes, he saw not just rage, but something deeper and more disturbing: emptiness. A void where humanity should have existed. "No," Solomon said, finally lowering his gun slightly. "Your life isn't mine to take. Justice will decide your fate, not vengeance." Holloway's bitter laugh held a note of triumph, despite his defeat. "Still hiding behind your so-called principles," he mocked, "still pretending to be better than what you are, a killer, ghost hand, a taker of lives." "I was," Solomon acknowledged. "I'm not anymore. Haven't been for 15 years. He stepped closer, looking down at his fallen enemy. "That's the difference between us. Cyrus, I changed. You couldn't. Arum." As Holloway opened his mouth to respond, a movement in Solomon's peripheral vision caught his attention. A flash of metal from the shadows of an alley across the street. Without conscious thought, Solomon dove sideways, shoving Holloway clear in the same motion. A shot rang out. Solomon felt the bullet graze his side, tearing through his coat and leaving a burning furrow across his ribs. Rolling to his feet, he fired twice at the source of the shot. A figure staggered from the alley, one of Holloway's men mortally wounded by Solomon's return fire. The man collapsed face first in the mud, his rifle clattering beside him. Solomon turned back to Holloway, who lay where he had fallen, staring at Solomon with an expression of utter disbelief. "You saved me," Holloway said, his voice barely audible. "Why?" Before Solomon could answer, Sheriff Maddox arrived with several armed townspeople. "Blackwood, you all right?" he called, noting the blood seeping through Solomon's coat. "Just a graze," Solomon assured him, never taking his eyes off Holloway. "It's done. Sheriff Holloway's men are finished." Maddox nodded grimly. "Most dead or captured. A few ran when they saw the tide turning." He looked down at Holloway with undisguised contempt. "This one's headed for a proper prison. This time, no fancy lawyers or political friends to save him." As two deputies moved to secure Holloway, the wounded man continued staring at Solomon, bewilderment mixing with the pain on his face. "Why," he repeated, "why save my life after everything?" Solomon holstered his weapon, suddenly looking tired beyond his years. "Because killing is easy, Cyrus," he answered quietly. "Living with it is the hard part." He turned to Maddox. "Get him a doctor before you lock him up. Those knees need attention if you want him to stand trial." Maddox looked surprised but nodded his agreement. As Holloway was carried away, still staring back at Solomon with uncomprehending eyes, Grace appeared from the direction of the church. "Solomon!" she cried, rushing to his side when she saw the blood on his coat. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her, though he winced slightly as she examined the wound. "Barely broke the skin." Grace didn't look convinced but seemed to accept his assessment for the moment. "Is it over?" she asked, looking around at the aftermath of battle. The smoking ruins of buildings, the bodies being collected, the wounded receiving attention from the town doctor and volunteers. Solomon nodded slowly, his eyes surveying the same scene. "This part is," he replied cryptically. Dawn was breaking over Whisper Creek for the second time since Holloway's initial attack. This sunrise revealed a town battered but unbowed buildings, damaged but repairable citizens, wounded but alive community bonds, tested but strengthened. As the golden light spread across the main street, illuminating both destruction and determination, Solomon Blackwood stood at the center of it all, a man who had tried to escape his past, only to find that in confronting it, he had finally found his future. 3 days after the battle that would later be known simply as the Night of Fire in Whisper Creek's history, Solomon Blackwood stood in his shop surveying the damage. Bullet holes riddled the walls. Shattered glass still littered the floor, despite Grace's best efforts to clean up, and several of his precision tools had been destroyed in the initial attack. Yet amid the destruction, Solomon felt a strange sense of peace. The shop could be repaired, the tools replaced. The wounds of the town would heal just as his own wound, properly bandaged, now was beginning to mend. Grace entered from the back room carrying a tray with coffee and fresh biscuits from the hotel kitchen. "Mrs. Henderson says these are a thank you," she explained, setting the tray on the one workbench that remained intact. "Though I think half the town is planning to bring you food today, so pace yourself." Solomon smiled slightly, not used to being the center of attention. Better get used to it," Grace replied, pouring coffee into 2 chipped cups. "You've gone from the silent watchmaker at the edge of town to Whisper Creek's official hero." The word made Solomon uncomfortable. He shook his head. "Not a hero, just did what needed doing." "That's precisely what makes you one," Grace countered, handing him a cup. "Heroes aren't people who seek glory. Solomon, they're people who do what's right when it matters, regardless of the cost to themselves." Before Solomon could formulate a response, a knock sounded at the door, or rather at the doorframe, since the actual door was currently propped against the wall awaiting repair. Sheriff Maddox stood in the entrance, hat in hand. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, nodding greetings to them both. "Coffee," Grace offered, already reaching for another cup. "Much obliged," Maddox accepted, stepping carefully over debris as he entered. "Army patrol arrived this morning from Fort Laramie. They've taken custody of Holloway and his surviving men. They'll stand trial at the territorial capital next month." Solomon nodded, unsurprised by the news. "His wounds. Doctor says he'll live, though he'll never walk right again, not with both knees shot." Maddox studied Solomon's face. "He's been asking for you, says he needs to speak with you before they take him away." Solomon's brow furrowed slightly. About what? Wouldn't say, just insisted it was important. Maddox shrugged. Army captain says they're leaving at noon. If you want to see him, it'd have to be before then. After Maddox left, Grace watched Solomon as he stared into his coffee, clearly wrestling with the decision. You don't owe him anything, she said quietly. No, Solomon agreed, but sometimes closure isn't about debt. An hour later, Solomon stood outside the makeshift cell, where Holloway was being held until the Army patrol departed. The man inside bore little resemblance to the elegant, intimidating figure who had arrived in Whisper Creek less than a week earlier. Holloway's fine clothes had been replaced with simple prison garb, his imperious bearing diminished by pain and defeat. Both legs were heavily bandaged, and his damaged hand was wrapped in clean linen. Holloway looked up as Solomon entered, surprise flickering briefly across his features, before settling into a neutral expression. Ghost hand, he acknowledged. Didn't think you'd come. You asked to see me, Solomon replied, simply remaining standing near the door. Holloway studied him for a moment, as if searching for something in Solomon's face. Why did you save me? He asked, finally echoing his question from the battlefield. You could have let that bullet find me. No one would have blamed you. Hell, they'd have given you a medal. Solomon considered his answer carefully. Because killing you wouldn't have brought back anyone you hurt, wouldn't have healed anything. Mercy again, Holloway said. But the mockery that had previously filled his voice when speaking the word was absent now. Not mercy, Solomon corrected. Choice, the same choice I made 15 years ago. The choice you never understood. Holloway was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. 15 years in Leavenworth. He said finally, 15 years with nothing but hate to keep me warm, nothing but plans for revenge to keep me sane. What a year one us. He looked down at his bandaged legs, and now I'm headed back to prison, probably for the rest of my life. That was your choice, Solomon reminded him, not mine. Yes, Holloway agreed, surprising Solomon with his admission. My choice, my hate. He looked up, his eyes clearer than Solomon had ever seen them. It's a poison, isn't it? Hate eats you from the inside out until there's nothing left but the shell of a man. Solomon didn't respond, sensing Holloway needed to speak more than he needed to hear. I've been thinking, Holloway continued, his voice softer now, about that family in Nebraska, the woman and children, about what my brother was really doing at Antietam when you shot him. He swallowed hard. About who I became after you spared my life. Solomon remained silent, but his attention was focused entirely on the man before him. I told myself I wanted justice. Holloway said, told myself you deserved to suffer for what you did to me, to my brother. But it was never about justice, was it? It was about power, control. His voice broke slightly. About proving I wasn't weak, wasn't beaten. Hate makes prisoners of us all, Solomon said quietly. Some just have more visible chains than others. Holloway looked at him sharply. Is that why you were silent for 15 years? Your own kind of prison? Solomon nodded slowly. In a way, silence was penance, and protection words can wound as surely as bullets, can destroy as thoroughly as fire. But you're speaking now, Holloway observed. Yes, Solomon acknowledged, because sometimes silence becomes another kind of prison. The two men regarded each other, enemies bound by a shared history of violence and its aftermath, each shaped by the other's actions in ways neither had fully understood until this moment. I wanted to kill you, Holloway confessed, dreamed of it every night for 15 years, planned every detail. He shook his head slowly. But when the moment came, when you were standing over me with your gun, do you know what I felt? Solomon waited, saying nothing. Relief. Holloway said the word barely audible. Relief that it would finally be over, that the hate could stop. He looked Solomon directly in the eyes. But you denied me that too, made me live with my failure just like before? Not failure, Solomon corrected. Sure, humanity, there's a difference. Holloway considered this doubt evident in his expression. Is there for men like us? For any man who chooses it, Solomon replied with quiet certainty. A commotion outside signaled the arrival of the Army patrol. Their time was ending. I won't see you again. Ghost hand, Holloway said, straightening his posture as much as his injuries allowed. They'll bury me in some territorial prison, and that will be the end of Cyrus Holloway. Solomon moved toward the door but paused before leaving. Not necessarily the end, he said, just a different kind of beginning. Depends on what you choose to build in the silence. As Solomon turned to go, Holloway called after him, Blackwood? Solomon looked back. Thank you, Holloway said simply, for the lesson it took me 15 years to learn. Solomon nodded once, acknowledgement and farewell in a single gesture, then walked out into the sunlight where Grace waited. Are you all right? She asked, searching his face for signs of distress. Yes, Solomon replied, and meant it. Something had shifted within him during that final confrontation with Holloway. A weight lifted, a chapter closed. They walked back toward the shop in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The town around them was already beginning to rebuild. Carpenters repairing damaged storefronts, shopkeepers sweeping glass from sidewalks, neighbors helping neighbors as they had always done. What happens now? Grace asked as they reached the shop. With the town, with us. Solomon paused on the threshold, looking back at Whisper Creek spread out before them. The town will grow, he said with certainty. The railroad will come. Change is inevitable. And us. Grace pressed gently. Solomon turned to her, really seeing her not just as his assistant, or even as the brave young woman who had stood by him during the fight, but as someone who had become essential to his world without him fully realizing it. I've been thinking about Montana, he said carefully. Good country, peaceful, could use a watchmaker. Maybe two. Grace's eyes brightened. Two. If you're interested, Solomon added, uncharacteristically hesitant, in a partnership. Shemana, the word hung between them, laden with possibilities beyond mere business. I've never been to Montana, Grace said, her smile widening. But I hear it's beautiful country, might be worth exploring. Solomon nodded, relief and something like happiness lightening his features. We could leave after the rebuilding, when the town's back on its feet. I'd like that, Grace said simply. 3 months later, as autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, Solomon Blackwood and Grace Andrews stood on the platform of Whisper Creek's brand new railroad station. The town had been transformed in the time since Holloway's defeat. New buildings had risen where damaged ones had stood. The promised railroad had indeed arrived, bringing with it new opportunities and faces, and the events of that violent summer had already begun to take on the polish of local legend. Sheriff Maddox stood with them watching as their trunks were loaded onto the waiting train. Town won't be the same without you two, he commented, especially now that folks have gotten used to hearing your voice, Blackwood. Solomon smiled slightly. They'll manage towns, endure, people adapt. That they do, Maddox agreed, offering his hand. Montana's gaining a fine watchmaker and a fine man. Solomon shook the sheriff's hand firmly. And Whisper Creek retains a fine lawman. As the train's whistle sounded, signaling the final boarding call, Grace hugged Maddox goodbye and moved toward their car. Solomon lingered a moment longer. Thank you, he said quietly to Maddox, for standing with me, for believing there was more to me than silence. Maddox nodded, understanding the depth behind the simple words. Safe travels, Ghost Hand. He said, using the old name with newfound respect. Solomon boarded the train, joining Grace in their compartment. As the locomotive began to move, they watched Whisper Creek recede through the window, the town that had harbored Solomon's silence for 15 years, and ultimately helped him find his voice again. Having second thoughts, Grace asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Solomon shook his head. No, just remembering. The past has a way of staying with us, Grace observed. For better or worse. Yes, Solomon agreed. But it doesn't have to define our future. As the train picked up speed, carrying them toward the Northern Territories and whatever awaited them there, Solomon Blackwood felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine hope. Not the cautious contentment he'd found in his years of silent watchmaking, but true hope for a future unburdened by the ghosts of the past. The war was truly over now, the silence broken. And in its place, something new had begun, something built on choice rather than obligation, on possibility, rather than penance. as mountains rose in the distance, marking the frontier beyond which their new life waited. Solomon reached across the space between them and took Grace's hand in his. No words were needed, a lifetime of silence, having taught him the value of gestures over speech, and Grace, who had learned to read meaning in his silences long before he'd found his voice again, understood perfectly. Together they watched the landscape unfold before them, each mile putting distance between who they had been and who they might become. A journey that had begun with 15 years of silence and would continue with whatever voice they chose to give it. Silence has weight. It can protect, punish, or preserve a sanctuary, for some a prison for others. For 15 years, Solomon Blackwood carried his silence like armor, against a world that had seen too much of what his hands could do. The clocks he mended marked time differently than the bullets he once fired, minutes and hours instead of lives and deaths. Yet both required the same steady hand, the same unflinching precision. The watchmaker and the marksman, two sides of the same weathered coin. In the ashes of Whisper Creek's night of fire, something was found among all that was lost. Not redemption, for some debts can never truly be paid, but perhaps something rarer, the courage to choose a different path forward. To speak when silence no longer serves, to save rather than destroy. As the train carries them north toward mountains that have never heard the name Ghost Hand Blackwood, we're left to wonder about the echoes that follow us. How long they linger, how far they travel, whether the voice we find after years of silence speaks the same truths we once knew. Some ghosts, after all, don't haunt us because they can't rest, but because we're not yet ready to let them go.